This past Monday morning, we had a special Oscars panel that focused on the winners and losers. Well, the show is still making headlines, and many of them are about host Chris Rock. Charles, Rock has been taking some heat from Asian and Latino groups. They say his commentary focused exclusively on Hollywood's black-white divide at the expense of addressing other minorities. What do you make of that?
You know, the expense, I wouldn't go that far. I think the broader conversation is about diversity, but here it is. I mean, what initiated this whole conversation to begin with was coming from the African-American response to the Oscars. So I think in just to take a look at things, I mean, he's a comedian, and he goes after a lot of folk. I mean, we can see what happened with Stacey Dash to what happened with the young Asian children that were on the stage. But if we're looking at ourselves as accepting human beings and what needs to be broken down in Hollywood, the fact even the crickets that Stacey Dash received, she didn't receive space. These young children, I think there's this myth around mathematics, and sometimes I have to say, wow, I wish when I was a kid, people, kind of
that was the problem.
that was the problem with me instead of like, you're dumb. But that is a reflection of actually Hollywood itself. Like, if you probably look within those offices and who's working there, and so I think there was something that was being said larger, and I think it's great that that we have groups that are getting upset. Maybe they shouldn't be going after Chris Rock so hard. They're still being excluded.
Okay, well, I want to talk
up.
about this particular joke in a moment that he made about the three Asian children in little suits. But first of all, in terms of what he didn't say during the broadcast, the National Hispanic Media Coalition Civil Rights Organization tweeted, #Oscars So White is just about white and black, but also about a lack of Latinos, Asians, Native Americans in film. #Oscar fail. Rachel, what do you think? Like, what obligation did Chris Rock have to address the issue of diversity more broadly?
I don't think he had any obligation to do anything other than speak for himself. I think that that's what Chris Rock did. And I think that there were things that he said that I didn't like, that I thought were tasteless or whatever. But he is a singular artist with a point of view, and he represented himself. And I think that with like everybody I admire and like, they have blind spots. They have things that they do better than others. And I understand that lots of people feel excluded, but I don't know that it's Chris Rock's problem. And I feel like why a black comedian is being held to account for all of the failings of Hollywood. And I actually think that people that are I think a lot of people have a much more nuanced take on what happened. There was a movement. I want to get it correct. I think it's #only1%, where Asian actors have been speaking out about their absence of representation. I don't think one movement excludes the other, and I think that there are lots of people talking about inclusion and representation in Hollywood that are talking about it in a very broad, nuanced, fully inclusive way. And I think the thing that's great about Chris Rock is he represented himself, and his failings or his successes are his. He didn't go on stage as the black community. He went on stage as Chris Rock.
Look, I mean, it's a miracle he was able to do anything. Exactly. Last week we were on here talking about what is he going to say, like how is he going to do this? I mean, I think more broadly we have to understand that we want progress, but that doesn't imply perfection. And that doesn't imply that everyone needs to be perfect all the time. I mean, how could he? I think to Charles' point earlier, like this was the year where the Oscars, where there were all these great African-American films, all these great films that came out of the African-American experience that got totally snubbed in a just absurd way, and in a way that was unignorable. And he was addressing that particular reality. I mean, are we really at the point where it is the job of Chris Rock to solve the crisis of the world? I mean, he is not a preacher. He is not a professor. He's not a theorist.
And he's not even an activist. I mean, he's
not an
comedian.
Activist. He's just a funny guy. And by those standards, what he pulled off was quasi-miraculous.
And I hope that it instigates other folks to just stand up and you start, every community's got to mobilize from within. And so therefore, hopefully you're building allies as you're doing that. Because, if you're trying to move together in a certain way, well, we need some folks to actually stand up from each culture to actually.
Yeah. And again, I think it's fair to say, that was a great joke that Chris Rock told, and you know what? That joke was tasteless or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a mug's game to think that there's some kind of consensus, that there's one person who can make everybody happy and represent every view, and he can
at one event.
Exactly. And people can call him on stuff, but I just don't think that he has an obligation to represent represent everybody.
Well, we've been talking about what he didn't say. In terms of what he did say, one of Rock's jokes that Charles alluded to involved 3 accountants from PricewaterhouseCoopers who tally the Oscar votes, and the accountants in question were revealed to be 3 Asian children in little suits. Now, that gag has been criticized for perpetuating stereotypes. NBA star Jeremy Lin criticized Rock. The head of the lobby group Asian Americans Advancing Justice called the Oscars show, and especially that segment, a setback for diversity. What about that joke, Stephen? Does that undermine any of his other jokes, in your opinion?
I just think we really have to keep our eye on the prize here. Not that they don't have a claim, not that Jeremy Lin doesn't have a claim to be offended by that joke. I mean, surely we're in a world where, if you feel offended, you can express it, but that doesn't mean it invalidates the whole of that argument. I mean, the other thing I think we have to remember here is that the exclusion of African-American actors from the Oscars has real economic consequences, and those economic consequences have cultural consequences. They affect what is portrayed and what is not. Chris Rock's joke has no effect on anything. It is just a bad joke. It's just a tasteless joke. And I think we have to really understand that we have to keep our eye on what is consequential here from what is just, marginal and accidental.
What do you think? Sorry.
Well, I think that one thing that does happen for people, and I would say that, if we're talking about Chris Rock, where I think he does have a blind spot, sometimes around gender and sometimes around gay issues, is that I think that when you care, like when there's somebody who's an artist that you care about, that I think there can be a feeling, certainly I've had it, where you feel sort of like hurt, like there's this moment of like, oh, like I really like them, and then they did that thing that makes me, it hurts. So I really get why people felt that way. And again, I think that it speaks to the problem of inclusion is that, of course, when you trot out 3 little Asian kids on stage and make a joke about all Asian kids are good at math, when you have limited representation in the Asian community, and that those are basically most of the Asian representation at the Oscars are those little kids, I understand why people get upset. I just don't think that it's all solely falls onto Chris Rock.
I think the final question around this is, what should we reasonably expect from a comedian on a night like this? And what purpose does it ultimately serve? How far, Charles, do you think a comedian can go at an event like the Oscars to criticize the Oscars and also host the Oscars effectively?
It's a tricky thing. I mean, I think he went at it, but I think there was this place where him putting up front that, if hosts were being nominated, he wouldn't get this job. I think there's something he's lucky to be in his position. I don't know what's going to happen after this, but it's a platform. And for an African-American individual of any vocation to have that floor and that space to speak on something that is personal, that affects the brothers and sisters in a certain way, I think they're going to take it and they should run with it. I think the lines. I think he would. I didn't think he went. Some things absolutely made me feel uncomfortable, but I still kind of understood what he's trying to say about it. Like I try to do that with every comedian that I take in because they are going after things. It's the nature of what they do.
And you have to be prepared for that.
You have to be prepared for that. I think the one thing that was there was a miss that Miss Nina Simone. There was a film about her that was made that totally was not talked about. Someone who actually where there's music and there's spirit and there's experience that really could have been like. So there are missed opportunities to fill that space from inclusion to all this stuff, but it doesn't fall on Chris Rock.
I think it really was, and we talked about this last week. It was an impossible task. Yeah. It's such a huge moment. I mean, for me, the miss was not referencing the Justice for Flint.
Yeah. That's right.
Event. But how can you do it all? Exactly. I mean Sai just came from Stephen Marche there. You can't do all these things.